moment or two the news that the presenter at the BBC, who was said to have paid thousands of pounds to a teenager for explicit photographs, is Huw Edwards. His wife, Vicky Flynn, was the one who made that public in a statement, which we reported here on Drive just a moment or two ago. A thought or two on that now is about, I mean, when you see the news that it is Huw Edwards, the lead anchor for BBC News on the 6 o'clock bulletin, the 10 o'clock bulletin, probably the most senior news broadcaster at the BBC, in many ways the most senior broadcaster for news and current affairs, who anchors events such as Trooping of the Colour, royal events, those great sort of state occasions. We can now see and say very clearly, we're not talking about someone who was a big personality on the BBC. We're talking about someone who in many ways was the BBC on those occasions, which explains in many ways the magnitude of this crisis at the corporation.
Yeah, and his wife has said in this statement that he's receiving inpatient care for serious mental health issues. And so this explains, I think, why there had been this strange silence from the Beeb, and why actually ministers went from being very firm about this on Sunday morning, saying the BBC needed to get its house in order, to following, I think, a conversation between the Culture Secretary and figures at the BBC, to slightly sort of softening the line and saying this needed to be investigated properly, because I think it became apparent once they'd actually looked into it that this was a much more complex case than some of the sort of, I suppose, the salacious social media feeding frenzy had suggested. But it's got really, really messy for other figures at the BBC. I mean, Jeremy Vine seems to have gone on his show sort of every day this week so far to urge the presenter to name himself and to say that he's been getting a great deal of abuse because people have been claiming it's him, and there's been other figures who felt they've been wrongly suspected of being responsible as well. So it's clearly something really deeply awful is happening for Huw Edwards and his family, but I think there are questions about the duty of care from the BBC to its other presenters as well. Yeah,
well, indeed, and the news that we've now heard just a moment or two ago, it goes a very long way to explaining it was obviously an acutely sensitive matter for the corporation from the beginning, from the time of the first reporting by the Sun newspaper. But now we know the identity. Those sensitivities are just magnified and magnified again. And given what we've heard now, this evening, we are talking about a story which is a hugely important public story in the eyes of so many people, but also a story of human anguish to so many people on so many different levels. Let's get the thoughts now of Professor Ivor Gaber, who's a professor of journalism. Welcome to you, Ivor.
Thank you, John. And just in case you hear noise in the background, I'm at Wimbledon at the moment.
You're at Wimbledon. Well, okay. Well, don't interrupt the play, Ivor. If you can, in as far as you can speak freely, what are your thoughts on what you've heard?
Well, I'm shocked, but not surprised in a sense. Shocked because I've known Huw and worked with him, but I'm not surprised because in that game that we've all been playing in the last 5 days, working out who's not suddenly appearing, his name had cropped up. But in terms of human anguish, as you just mentioned, it's terrible. He's in hospital. But as you yourself are saying, this is a real crisis. Maybe before, when we were speculating, it wasn't. But he is, as you say, almost the voice of the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, and now I guess we'll wait to see how it develops from here. His wife, Vicky Flynn, is calling for privacy for the family, but that will not stop the discussion, the analysis, the autopsy on what's been going on over these days. And what about the BBC? How do you expect them to deal with this news?
Well, I mean, as you said earlier with your interview with Isabel, it explains why they've been walking this tightrope. I think they've now got to be totally transparent. I mean, Vicky's statement didn't actually accept that didn't say anything about the allegations, just said what a terrible time it's been for him.
Yes.
So that is still very open. I think the BBC now has to do, it's not quite a mea culpa, because as employers, they have a duty of care, and that's being told that Huw was in hospital. It put them in a terrible dilemma, but now, I won't say all bets are off, but they've really got to say everything they know, I think.
Yes, and I suppose the news we were reporting just a moment or two before the news that Huw Edwards is the presenter concerned. The police are not proceeding with a criminal investigation, which again adds another tilt to the story.
It is a twist, because if the allegations in the Sun were true, there were clearly criminal behaviour taking place. So it does all make it a little bit more murky. I suspect in the end we'll find that the stories we were hearing were more or less true, but not quite as salacious as we were led to believe. But, I'm speculating.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. Well, I guess in that sense, speculation is all that there is. But there are still questions about the background to this story. The latest context of the announcement, the news from Huw Edwards' wife, that he's suffering from serious mental health issues. He's being treated as an inpatient. That, of course, casts a different light on much of the story, but there's still the background of this to be examined, and it needs still to be examined. Still many questions to be answered. I mean, some of these allegations, these suggestions, they go back a long period, raise questions if not of criminality, then of a broader question for society, if you like, about how far is it appropriate for the public to have a say in the life and the position of someone like a leading presenter. How far does their take on his conduct bear on his fitness for that role? What role and judgment should the BBC and its management take in all of that? All of these are questions which bear, I think, discussion. Either way, but anyway, let's thank you for coming on the programme. This is going to run a while yet, Isabel.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And I think, as you say, there's going to be a discussion more widely about privacy and about the extent to which people who are the subject of these kind of stories deserve to be kept anonymous. This has obviously become very messy because of that, as I said, for other presenters. But it was a pendulum swing away from what happened with Cliff Richard, and an understandable reaction by the media to naming somebody and pursuing them too early, basically. And that this is something that we've seen quite a lot in Parliament as well, where MPs who are the subject of allegations haven't been named, which has really annoyed those who've made the allegations, because they feel that actually getting the name out there might encourage other victims to come forward. So it is a really difficult balance, and the really sort of confounding factor in all of this, of course, is social media, because it doesn't matter what we don't say on the radio, it doesn't matter what the newspapers aren't printing. Names have been trending on Twitter for days now, and it's as your guest just mentioned, it's been a sort of jigsaw identification game.
Yes.
Ever since the Sun first splashed on this. So
yes. Which only intensified the interest.